I've been asked to do a pilot program dealing with writing across a curriculum and the genre of close readings, which are used in philosophy, but also in history, humanities, English, a lot of other things. And I put together a website that's on my faculty website as a subsite, which I can't access because apparently UNC FSU is considered a dangerous site for this computer. So you can't see it. But I've got this on there. If you go to my faculty webpage, you can find links to it. So this is part of a larger project. And if you think about where professors typically are during their formation, and this is less of a problem now for younger professors because they get some training in pedagogy. But for those of us who were on the early end of the Generation X generation, I know I had a few pedagogy classes, but we didn't take them that seriously, right, frankly. What we were interested in was our research, because that's what you do in graduate school. And so, this is the kind of story that was my story, and it's a story of many other professors. Once upon a time, there was a grad student who had they been spending their time with other grad students, not with undergraduates, not with the people that they're going to be teaching. They'd excelled in and enjoyed learning. That's why they were in graduate school, not for the big bucks that it provides you. And in this case, it's somebody who had been taught about and thought a lot about Plato and Platonic Dialogues. And they saw something attractive in Plato's dialogues, and they wanted to study them further. And one way that you get to do that is by teaching classes on it. Another sort of typical experience. So then they started out teaching undergraduates, and beginning level teachers are quite often full of passion. They know what they want to communicate, and they see something desirable there, and they want to pass it on to their students. But what is undergraduate teaching like? I've never taught well-prepared students. I've taught in a number of different places. This is my first time in HBCU, but I've taught in small liberal arts colleges where you get students who are substantially prepared and motivated. I've taught in prisons. I've taught in a number of different places, and I see the same sort of thing come up. The students are often underprepared for college-level work. And what do they lack? They lack certain basic lower-order skills that then have to be scaffolded that would allow them to adequately understand Platonic dialogues if you want to teach that sort of thing. And so what do they provide us with? Unless we provide them with a lot of structure and guidance, they give us products that, quite frankly, are just not up to snuff. And often they seem clueless about what they're supposed to be giving us. But that's on their end. What's on our end? Well, and I'm just sort of echoing what my co-presenter was saying, we often don't grasp the difficulties our students are having. We set our sights way too high because we're evaluating them in accordance with the people that we were students with. And we expect students to be motivated. I don't think that's an expectation that we can actually have. And we expect students to have some idea about what they're doing. When a lot of the students are showing up to our classes and saying, I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing. I have no idea what philosophy is about. All I know is my advisor said I have to take this class. And one of the traps that we often fall into is assuming that because some things were easy for us to pick up and grasp, that it should be easy for our students. So we want to move on to the higher order skills that Platonic dialogues allow us to engage with, without realizing that they don't have the foundation to be able to do that. So active learning, Platonic dialogues, this is part of why they are a classic type of genre. They were one of the original sites for active learning, and they have been throughout the ages. They've been used pedagogically in a number of different philosophical and pedagogical traditions because they model dimensions of active learning for the students. They require students, if they're engaged with them, to provide arguments, to assess arguments, and they cultivate the desire to know, to find out what's true, what's good, what's beautiful. That's what the dialogues are about. Quite often, the passive attitude on students' part is an obstacle for us. And I don't really need to go through what that passive attitude is like because we've all experienced it. These are just some of its general features. Some of them, it has to do with the way in which they were taught. A lot of them were given formats in which there's a right answer, a wrong answer, you throw it out right away, and now you're done. And they don't realize that you go on with things. Some of it is affective. If it hurts or it's uncomfortable to be thinking about things, as it is often at first, then they're not going to put a lot of work into it. They're not going to throw themselves into it. Oftentimes they feel helpless. They feel at a loss, resourceless. And this leads to a lack of responsibility, not taking ownership. Active learning means that the students are actually thinking about, where am I going? What am I doing? And in critical thinking, actually, one of the key parts of it in the APA report on critical thinking, which is sort of the gold standard, one of the elements of critical thinking is attention to self, attention to what one is doing, self-correction. So what do we do about it? One of the things that I'm going to actually skip over, but is worth thinking about. Plato has this great discussion about why do people become misanthropic, and then why do they become misalogic, which means that they distrust argument. Well, it's because they set their expectations very high, and they're let down over and over again. And so then they come to distrust. Misanthropic people distrust other people. Misalogic people distrust arguments. And we might come to distrust our students. There's a danger of that, especially when we're trying to teach high-order thinking skills. And we're trying to teach great pieces of literature. Our students let us down over and over again. We may decide, well, they're just not worth investing ourselves in. But that's a failure on our part. It's a lack of critical thinking, actually. So I think we can take a cue from Plato's student. And who was Plato's key student? Think back to your old humanities classes or introduction to philosophy classes. Who was his most important student? Starts with an A. Great philosopher. Aristotle, right. This is a classic picture of Plato and Aristotle. It's often used in the introduction to philosophy texts to talk about the difference between them. Plato is gesturing up to the heavens. We need to think about the higher things. We need to take our guidance from those. And the other stuff will kind of fall in place. And he's kind of fuzzy about the details about how you get from the lower to the higher. Aristotle is sort of holding his hand out. And there's a difference between pointing and setting a basis. Aristotle is gesturing downwards to the base, to the basics, to the lower things. And for philosophers, this was not a good thing, right? Because we're interested in the higher things. But if we're thinking about it in terms of education, maybe this is a good thing. What do the gestures tell us? So, I'm going to skip through that a little bit quickly because I'm afraid of running out of time. But let's take an Aristotelian approach to Platonic Dialogues, which is a little bit, going against the grain. So what are Platonic Dialogues? Platonic Dialogues were written by this guy, who was a philosopher in his own right, had spent a lot of time with other people who were carrying out really high-order thinking and had thought a lot about this and wrote dialogues that are engaging if you have the keys to them, if you're ready to use them. So they're designed to engage our students on a high order. But before our students can do that, before they can, say, write a close reading paper, that's one of the genres of papers that we often assign in literature and history and philosophy. What do they have to do? They have to develop a lot of lower order skills. We can't take that for granted. They have to scaffold these skills before they can start doing close readings. So I was assigning close readings over and over again, and then just being baffled by how my students weren't getting it. I was providing them with assignment sheets, with rubrics, and I wasn't getting that. They just didn't have these lower order skills. So what would Aristotle tell us as a philosopher? Aristotle would say, well, look, you can't develop high order things until you have the bases. You have to actually have a solid basis to build on. And you need to be able to understand the affective side, how to shape emotions and desires. And then the students also have to have some idea where they're going. You can't just rely on them to do that. In Aristotelian terms, he talks about impressing form on matter, or getting the form to appear out of matter. And I think that's a good philosophical idea for this. And that doesn't mean throwing Plato aside. Plato, you still have this desire leading to higher levels, but we have to actually build the bridges that can get them to these higher levels. So we can lead some students to be able to fully engage in Plato's dialogues, which is what we would want. And again, think back to your introduction to philosophy classes or humanities classes. What was one of Plato's key concepts? The cave. And what was philosophy? It's leading people out of this cave where they're stuck looking at images and getting them to see reality. We use this as a metaphor for philosophy, but what we often forget is that this is a step process. In the dialogue, you don't just pull the guy out of the cave and say, the way we do in movies, and we say, look at this, and then suddenly it all becomes clear to them. Plato says you actually have to take this person out of the cave, and they're not going to like it. They're going to be upset with you, and they're going to struggle against you. And you have to gradually, show them things, show them first reflections in the water, and then you can actually show them the things themselves, and then you can actually show them the thing that's the source of light. You can't do this, automatically, or assume that it's just going to happen by itself. So I think this is exactly what we mean when we talk about scaffolding of skills. So then you might say, well, why are we going to do this with Platonic Dialogues? We're going to set our sights lower. Maybe we should stick with things that are easier. And there is some merit to that, but I think that we still should teach Platonic Dialogues, at least in humanities classes and philosophy classes and literature classes. Why? In part because Plato is part of the cultural heritage of world literature. What do we want for our students? Not just to be exposed to what is absolutely contemporary, but to gain a good grounding in world literature. The corpus of Platonic Dialogues, there's a little typo there, they possess intrinsic value. They have students engaging with argument. They have students thinking about, what is beauty? What is truth? Can moral goodness be taught to people? And there's also an instrumental or pedagogical value to Plato's dialogues. He constructed them as educational tools. And it's up to us to harness them. Now, we're going to harness them in ways, what I'm suggesting is we harness them in ways that Plato didn't intend. And I think that that's okay. But ultimately, what do we want to lead them towards? Lifelong learning. And that's where maybe they can't grasp Platonic Dialogues in their fullness in our classes right now. But if we get them on the right track, and we arm them with the skills that they need, and we give them practice in those skills, and we show them that Plato's dialogues actually are sites where we can cultivate those skills, maybe then the book doesn't get sold back. Maybe then, when they're 30, they reread the dialogues and they get more out of them.
Question for you. Could you give an example of a lower order?
Oh, I'm going to do that.
Okay, you have that set.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just trying to follow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are some of the things I think we need to do in order to promote lifelong learning, and these are all things that are also discussed, not necessarily using the terminology of scaffolding, but things that are discussed in Plato's dialogues. And one of the things I think we need to do is think about, and this is exactly, this is a good segue, yes. What lower order skills, first of all, can be focused on using Plato's dialogues as content. I'm not assuming that anybody is super familiar with Plato's dialogues. It may have years since some of you have read them. Which lower order skills should be focused on? This is sort of a question of what do they need in order to get there? And then which lower order skills are the most useful in moving students towards the kind of higher order skills we'd like them to have when they're studying Plato? That's a more idealistic question. Maybe maybe most of our students won't be able to do things at that high level in the first class where they encounter those dialogues. But it's still worth thinking about in order to motivate us. I'm going to skip through some of this fairly quickly. Again, if you want to see the full presentation, it's on my faculty website, a section that deals with close readings. One of the ways to practice lower order reading skills is to take a passage in a dialogue in class and have either you read it aloud or you have the students read it. If you have multiple people who are comfortable with that, you get as many voices as possible reading these dialogues. One of the things that you find they have to do is actually figure out who's talking at which point, and sometimes students are confused about that. And then you stop at different points, and you ask the students to explain what's being said in the passage on a literal level. Now, how much time can you devote to that? Well, as much time as the students need in order to master that skill of being able to just stop and say, in their own words, what's going on here. And I didn't put this into the presentation, but there's a dilemma. It feels like there's a risk in doing so. If we're supposed to be teaching them how to read Plato, and we're spending all this time on doing very low order, what seem to be very low order things, aren't we copping out? Aren't we sort of giving up on the possibility of these students being able to really engage at a high level with Plato? And I don't think that, I think that that's a false dilemma, but that it requires a lot of coordination in order to make it work. It is a true dilemma if the idea is, well, we just have them work with these lower order skills, and we spend a lot of time on that, and we don't move towards these higher order skills, which are completely discrete from them until they've got this down. But those skills aren't discrete. When we talk about them being scaffolded, that means that we're building from these lower order skills. We're building from the content that we're having them engage with to lead them towards higher order skills. Another thing that I think is a good practice is identifying the characters in speech and positions. Have the students actually identify who's saying what speech. That takes some practice in Plato. I've had paper after paper after paper where the student is attributing this position or this speech to this character when it's really this character who's saying it. So if we don't want students to do that, we have to lead them through that and actually sit them down and say, who's actually talking here? Socrates or Thrasymachus? Socrates or I am? Have the students determine the positions. Now we're starting to build towards higher skills. Not just who's saying, what are they actually saying? Then see if the students can determine the attitudes of the interlocutors towards each other. Plato's dialogues are full of little clues about how each character feels about the other character. And I think that that's worth having students do. I'm going to skip through to some critical thinking skills, practicing lower order critical thinking skills, the meat of philosophy. There are a lot of shorter arguments in Plato that are built up into larger arguments. So, what do we philosophers usually want to do with our students? We want to actually provide them with handouts that provide the whole big structure of the argument and get our students to grasp those arguments. And that's a failure on our part to expect them to be able to do that. Instead, first they have to get this little argument here as an argument. Forget all the rest of the context. And then once they've got that down, now they can get this piece right here. And then they can start building them together into larger blocks. And it's not just Plato that we would do this with. I've used Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail for the same sort of thing. That's a very large, well-structured, complex argument that ultimately has one finish point, one conclusion, which is it's okay to break the law in this case. And then there are all these other sub-arguments within it. If we want our students to be able to do that, to be able to understand the large argument, they have to understand the smaller arguments first. So I think it's okay, even if that means that we don't get to as much material, that we don't teach as many dialogues. If they get that stuff down, if they see how to do it, and we don't turn them off, then later on the lifelong learning can take place. Once, now they're equipped to do it. So what would we have them do with the shorter arguments? First, identifying the main claims. That might be something worth spending half a class session, just being able to identify what's actually being said. we can't take it for granted that students can do that. Then connecting the other claims made by the interlocutors used to support the first claims, putting premises together with conclusions, reconstructing the structure. And then finally, only after they've actually figured out what's actually being said, can they go on to say, is it right or wrong? Is there a good argument here or a bad argument? I give a few other examples of these, grasping Socrates' examples. He uses tons of examples. What's going on with those? Is he really arguing about shoes and shoemakers, or is he arguing about something else? That's a lower order skill that we can practice over and over again with our students so that they can then move towards higher order skills. So how do we progress them towards these? I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and I don't consider this an exhaustive list, but I think that this would help with Platonic Dialogues, and I think it would help with other similar types of literature where there's arguments involved. Multiple forms of assessment of the student assignments. With Platonic Dialogues, how can that be done? Well, you try to get the students to see themselves in the dialogues. Are you this kind of person? Are you this kind of person? Agreeing with Socrates at this point means you have something in common with this guy who died 2 millennia ago. That means something. Recognizing the attitudes of others. Recognizing why people do bad things. Those dialogues are about right and wrong, and the motivations for doing things well or doing them poorly, treating people well or treating them poorly. Caring, by this, think means what we would call affectivity. And what we want to do, ultimately, is get our students not just to acquire skills, but to want to practice those skills. So with Platonic Dialogues, ultimately, we can move, hopefully, students away from passive to active and engaged attitudes. And to be active and engaged itself is not simply dispositional, it's affective. It's because the students want things, they desire to learn. Also becoming interested in understanding the subjects of the dialogues. Platonic dialogues were designed to be read and reread and thought about for years. The guy who I studied Plato's Symposium with for an entire semester in Greek, Rick Williams from Southern Illinois University, he'd been studying it for 40 years. He'd been reading and rereading the Symposium, and I asked him about that, and he said, well, I won't say that every single time I read it I find something new, because after 40 years you should have most of it down. But there are still unanswered questions for me that keep me coming back to the dialogue. They're that sort of product. And so I think if we can get our students to desire understanding the things in those dialogues, or in other great philosophical texts, or other great pieces of literature, things that we want to expose our students to, and we would love to see them loving, that's what we want for them, right? We want them to become interested in really grasping these things. And then finally, learning how to learn. Plato's dialogues themselves are about education. What are the obstacles to becoming educated? What are the things that help them? For our students, this learning how to learn dimension means learning what lower order skills they need to work on. So I think we have to identify those in the assignment sheets that we give them. We have to say, this is actually what we're doing here. This is not the whole of understanding Plato, but this is going to be a building block for you. And then learning how to progressively move. That might take putting together maps for our students. I do this with some other assignments that use lower order skills and then move to higher order skills. I think our students probably these days actually need physical maps that they can see and say, oh, I get why I'm doing this now. Because I don't think we can take for granted that they have any understanding of these things. At least the students that we do. So, like I put on here, you can find fuller treatment of this on my faculty website. This is a long URL, but you can just go to UNCFSU's website, type in Sadler, and my website will come up. Any questions about this? No, perfectly clear, all right.
I think it's very interesting in terms of moving from those law of thinking to high thinking.
Yeah.
And I think it tells us that whenever we understand concepts, we can move further. But unless the fundamentals are there, if students are not learning fundamentals, it's very difficult for them to sound and move into the higher order way of learning. And sometimes we are so concerned about coverage that we do not spend enough time on those lower order knowledge base to ensure that students.
And I know I have done that over and over. That privileging, covering what I think has to be done in the class over hitting those lower order skills and really spending a lot of time in practicing. The other obstacle I found on my part was I didn't even have any idea what lower order skills they needed. Because for me, it was just sort of automatic. Well, you get the dialogue and you just read it, and you know who's talking at what point and what the smaller arguments are. Oh, that's perfectly clear. But for my students, it took me a while to realize that they simply didn't grasp those. Yeah.
I think what you have said about scaffolding skills, I think we don't do enough of that in school, in the classroom.
We do or we don't?
We don't.
Okay.
We don't. And I think most teachers think that's just a waste of time to give them the support that they really need by asking certain questions.
Yeah.
And they come in with the preconceived idea notion that students know how to do this thinking, and when they really have no idea. And that's what really, get them frustrated, as you alluded to, the students frustrated, and the teacher also.
Right, and that leads, it's kind of joking to put in that missile math, playing off of the Sanskrit, mathetes, Greek for students. There is a real danger, and I see this in a lot of my peers. I'm on Facebook with a lot of my fellow philosophers, and they, complain about their students, and they assign this, and the students didn't read it, didn't understand it, and the affect that they have is it's kind of dangerous for classroom teaching, because students perceive that. If you come in and your attitude is, well, most of you are dummies, you're not going to get this, I'm just teaching to those 3 students who are worthy of being taught, that destroys the classroom situation from the start. Especially, it's worse when it's our fault. And we philosophers are probably the worst at that. Yeah? You think so?
I know I have students who, they'll come, they have to belong to class, and they complain and say, I have no idea what this teacher is talking about. I don't know how to do this. Why do I have to do philosophy?
Yeah.
So the teacher say, read the chapter, explain, and they just can't conceptualize what's going on. And then I think the professor doesn't realize that you have different learning styles, different ways to reach out to the students, and it's just open the book, start talking, and then, okay, see you next week, do the chapter reading, and they get frustrated, especially with philosophy and logics.
Part of the reason is because philosophy deals with some of the most general concepts. It has a long history, so there's a large canon. And it's got this emphasis on putting together arguments. And so that's all, pretty high order stuff.
Right.
And we put it in a 100 level class, and we require a whole bunch of students to take it. And then we put in professors who haven't thought much about that, and, thought that was just, that's philosophy of education. I don't have to fool around with that. And I actually think that, I go around and I talk to people. This is a broader topic, but I talk to people and they say, what do you do for a living? Well, I teach philosophy. Oh, I took that class, it was awful. And I hear that over and over and over again. I think there must be just a lot of very bad philosophy professors out there in the last several generations. And we're just, we're turning people off. And the problem is the products that we have to offer, like Plato's Dialogues, they're wonderful. They have all these dimensions to them. When people actually do get into them, they love them, they want to keep studying them, and somehow we just keep closing doors instead of opening for our students. So, that's a bigger picture, perhaps.
Okay, any other questions?
I just have I was one of those students who said in my first philosophy class,
Yeah.
I just wanted to get through it.
Sure.
But let's face it, a lot of people who teach philosophy, who become philosophers, are very bright people who go straight on. They've never been in a classroom. They have never learned how to teach.
Yeah.
And so they don't think about how the students learn.
Right.
We just have this wonderful thing and we must all just absorb it. But then my second experience was very good. It was at Tuskegee University, and we had this Dr. Handy, who was a wonderful teacher. And then I was like, oh, this is philosophy. Isn't this wonderful?
Yeah.
Now, then I could see that it really was, it taught me thinking processes
Yes.
as well. So, but if we could just get our philosophy teachers to understand, or to take a course in teaching methodology, then
And to take it serious.
yes, and take it seriously.
We had to do it, but frankly, I didn't take it seriously myself until I started teaching.
But that's true in general, isn't it? It's true in general because a part of my responsibility at Fayetteville State University is to teach teachers how to teach. And one of the things that I say to my teacher education students is the vast majority of their professors are content experts who don't have a flying clue as to how to convey that content. Because what at higher education, what we tend to do is to hire experts in their areas really to teach. But these are not expert teachers. And so that's where the big divide is. I think that's the big divide in higher education. And so particularly for college professors who don't get that, they think, why isn't this student like me when I was a student, forgetting how they were when they were a student? See, and so I know Fayetteville State University is really doing something about it now, and a lot of institutions are really doing something about trying to understand and grasp this concept of, no, the teacher has to be taught how to teach in order to be a teacher. And I often say, we do not take that approach with airplane pilots. There's no such thing as a born pilot. People are trained to be pilots, just as we are trained to be teachers. We're trained to be teachers.
To put it in sort of statistical perspective, in philosophy, our flagship organization is the American Philosophical Association. And if you go to the Eastern Division of it, which is the main one, you'll see anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 people attend. The American Association of Philosophy Teachers, which really focuses on scholarship of teaching and learning, and has workshops on how to teach philosophy well. A good conference attendance is 120 people. So that gives you an idea about, even today, in 2010, what the proportion is of those who are just, content experts and want to do their thing, and those who are actually trying to use the research that's available, or further the research that's available, and teach well. And I suspect that it's probably somewhere in some of the other humanities as well, history, or English.
And they don't ask the right questions either.
The philosophers don't, or?
No, they don't. Let me tell you why I say that. Because they would ask students, what do you think?
Yeah.
And when the students give them their opinion, how they're thinking, they say, oh no, that's
I'm not
wrong.
interested in your
Yeah, that's right. So then they don't ask it, they turn it off.
Yeah.
Making the student feel as though
They
they
can think.
can't learn.
But again, they are not trained to ask the students the correct question. And so both the teacher and the student are now frustrated because they're both lost. I mean, literally, it's a situation where the blind is leading the blind. I'm told both will fall into the ditch. And isn't that what we're seeing in many instances? Because both have fallen into the ditch. When we do our statistical analyses of that, it's very clear to us. What's going wrong here? Well, both have fallen into the ditch.
And you know, the really sad thing about it is, within each great philosophical tradition, not just in Western philosophy, but also in Eastern philosophy, those who are part of the canon, they were all great teachers. Think about Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. The reason why we read Epictetus the Stoic is because somebody wrote his discourses down because he was such a great teacher. In the East, think about the role of Confucius. And yet, the people who teach about these often don't even, read. Aristotle talks about teaching over and over and over again, but a lot of the Aristotle scholars just skip over those passages. So